Let me just share the screen. I hope all of you are able to see the screen. Now I put the slides full screen just in case. Are you able to see the slides from online?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay,
yes, thank you.
great. So, thank you for inviting me in this talk. It's my first experience in the summer school, honestly, in providing a talk here. So I prepared something that is strongly related with the topics that I'm following right now as part of my research that concern indeed humanities data in general, in particular fair, compliant humanities data. And in the introduction, that it will be a kind of short talk, or short. It's Friday evening, more or less, so 1 hour talk can be perceived as a kind of long talk, considering the context. But I will basically provide you an introduction in 3 parts on this topic. First, that kind of background, why this idea of having fair data in the humanities, and so also when we treat cultural heritage objects is important. Then I will move on a specific, let's say, conceptualizations of the types of data that we may have in the humanities. It's not a comprehensive list, it will be just a preliminary list, I will say, but it's a starting point. And then I will move in the 3rd part to present, let's say, a use case scenario of these ideas. That is exactly the setting where I, with other colleagues, are developing methods and tools for handling fair-based humanities data. So before starting, this is usually this is the slide that I used to put at the very end, but it is let's say unfair to me to put it in the very end right now. I would like to acknowledge the effort that a lot of people have put in the past years around this topic. These people are there are also professors from basically this department involved as well. Are the names that I used to interact with basically since 1 year to do several of the works that I'm going to present in this talk. And also parts of the slides that I will present are actually let's say extracted from existing presentation that Bianca Bolandi and Bianca is a PhD student that is working with me, and at the same time is also one of the stewards in ARIC, in Area della Ricerca, at the University of Bologna. And we have done a bunch of presentations on this topic, and I reused part of the content from those presentations in the slide that I will introduce you today. So this is just to thank all the people that actually helped me a lot. Actually, I'm just the person who tells stuff that they are doing, basically speaking, but that is the aim. So part 1, why we should care about FAIR. I will start from a pragmatic point of view right now that maybe some of you can agree on or not, but still is a kind of point of view that is discussed a lot in academia, in particular in the past months. So usually when we prepare our curriculum vitae, where we put our experience in dealing with a specific scholarly topic, a huge part of that CV is actually filling with publications that we have done. Publications that are considered by a lot of different point of view as one, if not the main outcome of our research. Publication may be journal articles, can be conference proceedings, can be books, can be book chapters, just to mention a few of them. Okay, and let's say that depending on the specific discipline you are researching it, you may have more journal articles and books and this kind of let's say nuances, but still these are considered by the majority of the people as the actual research outcome of main research outcome of our works. And often these items are kind of crucial for our career because they are the main object used, for instance, in research assessment. There is a type of that research assessment exercise, because a lot of the judgment that people in the committee of assessment exercises in general, I'm talking about the scientific habilitation, but also about other kind of research assessment exercise at the national level, but also at the international level, use a lot publication to measure somehow, to evaluate us. This is what we usually say in the CV, but within research, indeed, we do a lot of different steps that are all connected to each other. We start usually with the preparation of a research idea that often allow us to, actually oblige us to write a grant application in order for getting money for finance to fund the research. Grant application in the end is a document where you have to convince some funders to provide you financial support for running the research. So we write this grant application. Then if we are lucky, and of course the proposal is considered good scientifically speaking, we move on. So we start to have money for hire people to work on a specific topic, a specific research question that usually is highlighted in the grant application. We start to analyze the existing literature, and we start to devise, for instance, a methodology that we want to run for collecting and analyzing data for answering the research question, which is highlighted in the grant application. So we develop or reuse or adapt, it depends on the situation, a methodology, which is indeed, let's say, usually a description of the series of steps I have to follow in order to gather the data, the information that I need for answering the specific research question. Then, of course, by running the methodology, we get new data, or we can even reuse data. We can mash up data, existing data, with new one that we are collecting. Usually, when we have to deal with a huge mass of data, often we have to use software for analyzing them, to prepare visualization of them, summaries of them. Sometimes the software already exists. Some other time you have to develop it from scratch, because there is nothing that is exactly tied with your specific needs. And then after you have collected the data, developed or reused the software, you have the methodology, then you, by means of the data, you discover basically the answer, the possible answer of your research question by running that analysis on the data. At that point, usually we start writing an article or a book that introduce somehow with a narrative the entire research that we have done, one or more articles. Here we are drafting in the end the manuscript, okay, and we can pass through a lot of let's say internal rewritings involving all the co-authors there. But at a certain point, once we think that the article or book is in a good shape, somehow we try to move on to submit that article to be published in a specific venue by a specific publisher. And there is when it starts basically the usual scholarly process of academic peer reviewing, where the article is taken by the journal, just to mention the journal as an example. The editor of that journal finds reviewers that are peers, basically, that needs to assess your article, in principle, to provide feedback to improve the work that you have done, because that's the idea of the peer review. The review by itself, if we see it from an ethical perspective, should be a way to help the authors to improve what they have done instead of being just a matter of acceptance and rejections. But I know that the nuances can vary according to the discipline, according to the venue in general. So the reviews are basically created by peers, are provided with the decision by the editor to the authors, and then the authors, according to the reviews and the decision, may decide to revise the article, adding additional material there, changing something about the analysis, rerunning part of the analysis, all these kind of things in order to produce a revised version of the article that then, if everything goes fine, will be at a certain point, let's say, accepted, hopefully, and then published by the authors. So that last step is when we have basically the article, the book chapter, whatever that we put in the CV. So you see how many things happens before, but you know already that before we are going there, before we have that specific output that is usually the only one that we are considering in the CV. And then after the publication of the article, of course, we may want to advertise our work, but to the general audience, not to expert people, but also to the society in general. So it may happen, for instance, that we write blog posts for advertising it. Of course, the wording, the narrative that we use in blog posts for advertising work is kind of usually different from the kind of narrative that we use in the article, because the article is usually thought for experts, for scholars, colleagues in general, expert in that specific topic. When you write on blog post, maybe you have in mind also scholars as the final audience, but scholars from different disciplines. So you need to have a vocabulary that can be understandable by people coming from different disciplines. And then at the very end of all this cycle, of course, we have a certain point, a step that is usually not handled by us about the research assessment that we have just mentioned before. Now, if we see this research work, okay, by itself, we can also see that indeed the stuff, the outcomes, the research outcomes that we produce during a research go beyond the classic article or book, but there are a lot, not just a few, a lot of additional stuff that are produced within the research. The grant application itself is a document, okay, has a value, the methodology, the data, the software, the blog post for advertise, for spreading the news about your work, the reviews done by others that are part indeed of the scientific endeavor there. So the point is that the scholarly society, the scholarly community have started to let's say consider all these different outcomes of research as valuable objects that should be considered as part of the production of a researcher. And in order to do that, a few years ago, a specific alliance, international alliance, have created what is called contributor roles taxonomy or credit, which is a taxonomy of a very small number of different roles that authors may have in the concept of a research, in the context of a research. You see conceptualization, data creation, formal analysis, etc., 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 that have been used since a few years to characterize somehow the contribution that people do in the context of the research, formalize contribution that people do in the context of the research. And I have to say that in the past years, several publishers have started to adopt the taxonomy. So instead of using, that is what was, let's say, that the habit before, the ordering of the authors for providing basically the contribution somehow in an implicit way. A lot of publishers right now who ask explicitly by following this taxonomy what are the contributions that each single author has brought, specific work published in a specific article. And that is kind of fine, because in that way you can just keep, in particular when you have a lot of authors, I have to say, you can keep just an alphabetic order sorting for the authors, because the contributions are actually defined in appropriate sections that say who have done what. That is the idea. But the point here is that this taxonomy has been used in the context of articles. We are still there, even if, let's say, the roles refers basically to all the other outcomes around the research, because we talk about, for instance, software. We are talking about the software, not the article itself. Of course, the software has been used for getting the results that you can see, read in the article. But the point is that the software is an object person. But the funny thing is that all these roles are kind of valid for a publisher when they are attached still to the article itself. So they have been defined in the article and not attached to the other outcomes, let's say. That was the situation since a few years ago. At a certain point, UNESCO started to care a lot about this concept of open sciences, a kind of, let's say, buzzword right now, but it is a very trend topic since a few years, because it has been also, let's say, advertised by the European Union, the open science, say, way of thinking, way of doing research is part right now of all the call for application for grants by the European Union. In general, UNESCO started by involving a lot of institutions around the globe to define a document that they call Recommendation on Open Science, that can provide the basics of what open science is, why it is important, and why we need to work towards its implementation in general. And one of the things that UNESCO say in this document, that is now the basic reference document that everyone uses when we want to talk about open science, one of the things that they say explicitly is that all research outputs, so all the outputs that someone produces in the context of research, should be considered as first-class citizens, meaning that basically they are at the same level. The article, the research data that you have obtained, the metadata describing research data in the article, the open educational resources that you may create starting from a research, the software, the source code, everything should be considered at the same level. And everything should be made available in a way that, let's say, foster its findability, its accessibility, its interoperability, and its reusability. Fair principles that I will address a bit with a bit more of detail in a few slides are one of the basic building blocks of open science. They are technically adopted and mentioned since years in every single document that talks about open science in the past 10 years. These principles are basically guidelines, okay, that one should use in order to be sure that the data are prepared accordingly to the expectation of the scholarly community in order to foster as much as possible the reusability of the data itself, also in other research, not only the reusability and also the transparency of the research in general. Still, in the UNESCO recommendation, something that is mentioned is that data should be as open as possible, should be made available as open as possible, meaning that we cannot make all the data open because we may have legal constraints of doing that. For instance, I can publish personal data of other people. By law, I cannot do that. Okay, I need to anonymize before doing this kind of activity of publication. So in that case, not all the data can be published as such, as open material, but the goal there, that is also recalled by the European Union in the Horizon Europe and also in the H 2020 program before, was you should put data available as open material when possible. That's the idea. So there is an effort that you have to spend in order to go in that direction, and there are luckily tools like the open definitions that allow you to understand what open means in this context, and so what are the licenses, for instance, that you should use for publishing this data. And one of the things that also the recommendations say, in particular, that goes beyond that list of resources that we have mentioned there, is also about the reviewing process. The reviewing process is part of the workflow, as I've just shown you before. So reviews themselves are research outcomes of a different level. I mean, they are not research articles, of course, but they are research outcomes that are necessary for reaching the best quality for a specific research, because it's exactly this dialogue with others, colleagues, that allow us to improve what we are doing. And so they are saying explicitly in this recommendation that reviews should be done by using open practices as well. In a sense, open practices in the sense that having platforms that allow not only selected reviewers, but also the interested community in participating in the process, and also putting in place practices that enable, not oblige, enable the possibility of disclosure of the identity of the reviewers. So that is what is happening around this recommendation. The point that we have always in the community tried to let's say, to introduce every single time we talk about open science. So there is this open science community, international open science community, and usually the open science community, let's say, agree on that principle, on this basic principle. Okay, the point is that to try to push this principle a bit further within the scholarly community at large. And that is, practically speaking, impossible without appropriate incentives. That's the main point. You need incentives for implementing this stuff. And the incentives do not come from researchers in this context. Incentives must come from institutions, must come from countries that believe in this idea of open science, and so somehow build mechanisms to let's say, assign additional, if you want, career perspectives for people that are doing the research in a good shape. Well, let's say good science. That was a kind of dream since a few years ago, but at a certain point, researchers around Europe started to organize themselves in a sort of coalition. It is an initiative that wants basically to try to push a kind of reform of research assessment, because the biggest incentives that us as researchers have is the assessment. If the effort that I spend in doing research well, following open science principle, will become part of my evaluation, and so from that idea of doing good science depends my career, then I had a kind of pushing to do it well, to follow this. So what they have tried to do with this coalition was to convince countries, and so institutions within these countries, that from now on, they have to implement the assessment process that follow open science guidelines. That is the idea. Okay. And they provided, let's say, 10 different commitments that should be signed by all these institutions in order for them to commit to implement these principles with a specific timeline. So by 1 year after a signature, to share all the actions that the institution devised for reforming the assessment itself, and by 5 years to change at least one assessment process by using these new principles, and also to run at least one cycle of reviewing by using the new assessment process that have been developed. This is the idea of the coalition. And in the coalition itself, there are a lot of topics that have been taken from the UNESCO Open Science recommendation. For instance, recognizing the diversity of contributions and careers when you do assessment, and also ensure transparency in the research assessment exercise, but also let's say in a way also provide recognition of all these people that do research in a transparent way. So transparency is from two different perspectives. Just consider transparency as a good way, a good behavior in research by the people doing research, and ensure transparency in the assessment process itself. So this is what QARA, that is let's say the acronym of this Coalition for Advanced Research Assessment, is doing. And I have to say that the signatories were kind of a lot in Europe. It's mainly a European movement, even if it has some signatories from outside Europe, but mainly is an European movement. And just saying that, within the Italian signatory, Italy is the second country with the biggest number of signatories in the QARA. So the very first institution that signed for reforming research assessment for following these new principles related to open science was Hamburg. And then after Hamburg signed, was the very first. Hamburg is also in the directive of QARA. And after Hamburg signed, a lot of Italian universities signed as well, including, of course, the University of Bologna. So this idea of reforming research assessment is not just a theory, it's something that concerns all of us. So we should start to think of doing research following these principles, because these are the principles that will be used to evaluate us. And this is true for any single discipline. Now, each discipline, of course, may have different nuances, because let's say the history of a discipline and the way of doing research in disciplines may be different from another. But the point is that all the single disciplines must start to think about this idea of moving towards open science, because we will be evaluated according to these new guidelines since in the next 5 years. In addition to that, it's not only that you should follow the same open science principle, as I anticipated before, but all the research outcomes that you publish, okay, so you have to publish not only the article, but also the software, data, etc., etc., etc. But in addition to that, you need to do it in a proper way. So it's just, you cannot just take a zip file with all your data and publish it in your website. That is incorrect. That is not the good way of doing it. You need to follow specific guidelines for doing this publication of all the specificities, all the specific research outcomes that are there. And the specific guidelines that are suggested are, again, those of the FAIR principles. FAIR principles are general principles. These findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability are general principles that must be applied to all the research outcomes, publication, data, whatever. That is the idea. The point here is that the application of this principle, and so the way you should act, you should behave to properly publish your research outcome according to these principles, change drastically depending on the type of the outcomes we are talking about. Publications instead of tabular data, instead of software, and all these kind of things. So the point here that the disciplinary groups are starting to work together in an international level in order to devise the right way to publish specific types of data that are proper to that specific disciplines. For instance, a few years ago, a group of researchers around the globe started to work on an implementation of the FAIR principle for research software. of course, the FAIR principles have been created originally thinking about tabular data, like medical data in general, but they must be applied to everything. So we need specific sub-implementation of each single guideline, each single discipline, depending on the type. So we have, for instance, the FAIR principle for research software. We have, for instance, the FAIR computational workflow that are basically implementation of the FAIR principles for computational workflow. But we have a plethora of different types of research outcomes that vary a lot depending on the disciplines. For instance, by doing an analysis that I will present in a few slides, basically, on the humanities domain, we discovered that one of the research outcomes of the research for some humanities project is an exhibition, to create an exhibition. Sometimes that exhibition is a temporary exhibition. So it's something that will finish itself. It's an event, okay, well, more than an event, because there is a narrative, kind of behavioral interactive way of disposing things. So there are a lot of stuff there. It's not just the event, but just saying that it's something, a product that at a certain point will disappear. And we need, since we will be evaluated in principle also on that kind of output, we need to find ways to make it fair, which is not easy when we talk about something that is pretty physical in the end. Well, there are also digital exhibitions, but let's focus for a while on the in-person one, okay, in a place. So that are basically all the kind of preliminary discussion saying, look, FAIR is important because FAIR is what is requested by funding agencies right now. They do not fund you if you are not able first to publish all the relevant output of your research beyond the article. Second, you have to publish them properly by following these principles. So what we have started to think of with some colleagues, in particular Bianca Volandi, who is the main person around several of these things that I will present in this second part, is okay, in the humanities domain, which kind of research outputs do we have to handle? Do we have to publish? Okay, the publication, that is fine, easy, okay. But what about the data? What about the methodology? There are something like that in the humanities research or not? So that is the main question that we had. We started again to reanalyze these FAIR principles in order to understand more or less what are the components of each single principle has. What are the main basic knowledge that every single principle actually defines. So the findability, of course, is something very important. If you want, the point here is to reuse data. So the final goal is just to find if there are already data that are suitable for my research. The point is trying to reuse them. But for reusing them, first of all, I have to make them findable. Okay, and to make them findable, we need necessarily to attach to the data a series of additional information like the metadata, descriptive metadata of the data. We need to assign to them, for instance, persistent identifier for being identified uniquely and univocally around the entire globe. We need to set up mechanisms to automatically find them by using research or search system appropriate for data, all these kind of things. Then accessible means that instead, once the user finds data, so we have found the data that we were interested in, we need to understand how to access that, because finding the data is not enough. Finding the data is just going in the entrance of an house. Okay, now we have door and we have to understand the data just beyond the door, and we have to understand which is the key to use in order to open that door. So the accessibility goes in that direction, trying to see, to promote the mechanisms that enable interested parties, user to use this data. Interoperable means that we need to put this data in to publish this data and the metadata associated with them in a format that enables someone else to read easily and reuse. If we use proprietary format, usually that is not a good choice if there is an open format available, because open format are easier to be processed by existing software. And finally, reusable also optimize the reuse of the data. And here, the metadata have a crucial role in order to understand, for instance, by descriptive metadata, what is the context in which this data may be reused. In order to build also automatic systems that may suggest recommending the data that are available out there for use for your research. So these are the generic principles. And as I anticipated before, these principles must be applied to different types of data. In principle, they should be applied to all the possible scholarly research objects that we publish within the research. But the point is that each single community discipline has its own, let's say, characteristics. So the interpretation of a certain principle may vary, okay, according to these different disciplines. But there is a general rule here that is pretty straightforward, even if not all people agree on that, that in the context of the FAIR framework, everything must be considered data, including publication. Publication are data. Indeed, if you think about it, in some research, in particular in the humanities, you use publications as source for your analysis, as source material for some analysis, sometimes, not always, but. So the point is that data as a concept should be considered a kind of universal term for everything that is produced by within research. So let's say that the scholarly research object produced by a research and data, according to FAIR, are synonymous, basically speaking. And indeed, as I anticipated, independently on the specific kind of data, we need some sort of characterization. This is an example. These are the 4 guidelines, FAIR guidelines, adapted for software. It is a topic that I'm very interested in. I'm a computer science. So I had a bachelor and a master in computer science, and then a PhD in computer science. And then I moved in the humanities department working on digital humanities, but I write a lot of software there. And so I need to publish software in a way that is fair according to the principles, and so to maximize its reusability for other research that I can do, but others can do by using my software. And so there is this adaptation of the FAIR principles that is explicit to software that provide different nuances of the various guidelines that are mentioned there. In particular, for instance, if we think about the reusability of the software, it's one of the biggest problems we have, because software depends on a lot of different dimensions, the operating system, the version of the specific programming language that we have used, and in time, all these things may become kind of old. So we need also to guarantee a mechanism to preserve and also run the software in 5 times starting from now. So there are a lot of different issues that concern typical software and do not concern other kinds of data. And the other important thing that each of us, technically speaking, should do, even if it's a new concept, that right now is in, let's say, introduced in a lot of call for grants, in particular the European level, is the creation of what is known as data management. So once we have clarified that everything is data, we need to create a document that describes how we are going to treat data during our process, our project, and also what happens to this data after the project ends, because a lot of time that is reasonable. I mean, when we have the grant for doing something, we are working on that something during the project. Once the project ends, a lot of times it happens that, and now who cares? Basically, no, the work has been done, and that's fine. The data management plan basically is something that you should produce in advance, even before the project starts, because before the project starts, you should have at least a general idea of what are the data that you need for answering your question. Of course, you can change slightly the number of data that you are handling during the process, but the data management plan is a tool that can be updated during the lifetime of the project. And it is a document that describes exactly what is the life cycle of the data that you are going to collect, to use for an analysis, and to publish for an use. There are a lot of software available online, free software also, that allow you to create data management plan according to the rules requested by the European Union. And in particular, let's say that for what concerns the cultural heritage domain in Italy, thanks to the work that have been done to the National Digital Library, they have produced several specifications for providing guidance for creating digitization of the cultural heritage in a way that is compliant with the FAIR principles and all these kind of specifications that I mentioned before. And in particular, there is one of these specifications which is entirely dedicated in the creation of the data management plan for cultural heritage objects, digitization of cultural heritage objects. So all these aspects are stuff that, as I mentioned here, by citing basically document from the ministry, are things that you should use for producing this kind of data. But then, as I anticipated, we have tried to look at the different nuances of this concept of data within the humanities domain, because data is a kind of dangerous word, I would say. It's very generic, and the humanities, in particular, the researchers working in the humanities, have perceived that the data that we use in the humanities domain is different from the data that we use in the medical domain. There are there is more complexity somehow in the data in the humanities, and it should be contextualized also to the domain and to the specific situation we are working on. It is a difficult, let's say, term. There is no consensus on the meaning of that term. Also because I have to say, the humanities is a very big
Allora, c'è anche il polvere.
is a very big term. In the humanities, we have a lot of disciplines, and these disciplines differ a lot from one another. So the point is that it's not really very easy to apply this concept of data in the same way, okay, in a uniform way, even across the humanity itself. And so what we have tried to do, in order to understand how to apply the concept of data, we wanted to understand what are types of data that people working in the humanities produce or reuse in the context of their research. And so we have done let's say a questionnaire. We have prepared a questionnaire where we have involved 19 different researchers from the Department of Classical Philology and Italian Studies. The structure of these methodologies is actually pretty generic, can be reapplied also in other departments. And one of the ideas I have to confess during this work was to try to involve this department in the analysis, because you have a lot of scientific areas there, scientific disciplines, a lot of SSD, different SSD that makes the thing pretty strong. And we involved 19 researchers because within the Department of Classical Philology and Italian Studies, we had at that time, still today, I have to say, 19 different academic disciplines. So we have selected one person for each academic discipline, and we have run this questionnaire by asking the researchers to talk about their research project. So the focus is on the project they were following, and also on the research materials they are collecting, generating, and use. We avoided on purpose to use the word data since the beginning in order to avoid bias. So we talked about research materials that you are reusing or producing. And then at the end, we ask that the research material that they have mentioned can be defined as data overload. And we have clustered, let's say, this researcher in these 5, let's say, macro disciplines: philology, literary criticism, language and linguistics, history of art, the science, and archival and library studies. So there are a few examples for the last 3, more examples for the last 2, because of the shape of the department. And what we have obtained across the various things that we have analyzed is a list of types of data that are basically used or produced by the researcher of the Classical Philology and Italian Studies department. And the list was sometimes even surprising, I have to say. I didn't expect some of these types of data because I didn't dealt with it, basically speaking, in the past. These are the lists. In the last 2 columns of the table, there are also numbers of how many of these researchers have produced that type of data or have reused that type of data in their research. There are a lot of different things. The first one that I was very surprised of was that of events, as I mentioned before, the exhibitions. I didn't do any exhibition as research outcome. Research. And so I was very surprised to see it, but it was a kind of, I have to say, usual kind of research output produced by the people, since 6 different researchers have produced as deliverable of a project, a conference or an exhibition, in physical exhibition or digital exhibition. So these are the things that have been produced. There are also more digital artifacts. And for instance, just to mention a few, the annotations that a philologist sometimes does on a specific text are done by means of digital tools. So they are created as digital material, and they are stored according to specific formats in that specific in a digital ecosystem. So even that one was something that I didn't thought of before. But there is here, let's say, across all these types of data, there is a very one of these types is very well represented. Of course, publication. Publication was the expected. Now, it was primary sources. I mean, we are talking about the Department of Classical Philology, Italian Studies, primary sources like manuscripts, artworks, whatsoever are, the basics of any research need. The primary sources usually are used in the research, not produced, of course. But there is one specific item that I started to be very interested in, I would say, that is the digital representation of cultural objects. So that is in the context of my department, that there is a huge interest in that, both in production and in using, because we have a laboratory there that is an analog digital laboratory that we have a lot of scanners for two-dimension scanning, basically, where we scan books, maps, this kind of things. Okay, so literary text. And so that since a few years we started to let's say produce a lot of this material in the context also of research that we are doing, and also reusing a lot of the material, because having a kind of good high resolution version of a manuscript available in the digital library allow all the researchers of the department to study it without accessing the actual original artifact that sometimes cannot be accessed anyway because of several constraints for preserving it, mainly. Okay, so that is one of the most interesting, let's say, type of research outcomes in my department, not only my department, I confess. And why I'm interested in that, and here I come to the third part, let's say, of the story. Well, because since more than 1 year, well, it started 2 years ago, but the project started actually 1 year ago. I have been involved in a project that is the project Changes. It is one of the Partenariati Estesi project funded by the PNRR in Italy, and is basically the only one dedicated for what concerns Partenariati Estesi, dedicated to the humanities domain. And it is basically organized in several sub-projects. It's a very big project. We are talking about more than 100 million euros for the entire series that is reorganized in several sub-projects that are all of each of it is a big project in the end. And the University of Bologna is principal investigator of one of these projects. It is the Spoke 4. Spoke is the name that is used for defining these sub-projects. And this Spoke 4 is entirely dedicated to the use of virtual technologies for the promotion, preservation, exploration, and enhancement of cultural heritage in museums and art collections. So there is an explicit focus on using virtual and digital tools for the cultural heritage. And since this project has been funded by the European Union, all the guidelines that the European Union have prepared in the past years about open science have been inherited by the code itself. So we need to follow all these principles of open science for producing all the research, and in particular all the objects that we are going to produce during the project, including the digitization of cultural heritage objects. And in particular, since we are talking about virtual technologies, a lot and museums and art collection, a lot of the effort within the project is done for creating, let's say, digital representatives of 3D objects. So we are talking about not two-dimensional objects, but about three-dimensional objects here. So what is the goal of the Spoke 4? The Spoke 4 was basically to work on different kinds of things, because the project is kind of widespread, so we need to work with different institutions, cultural institutions at the national level, spread across the entire country, and with different types of museums. And we have identified different types of museums here. I don't want to spend a lot of time describing what they are, but we start from, say, natural history museums to art galleries to museums with intangible heritage. There is a plethora of different kind of museums types here represented. And the goal that we have, in particular, since one of the main activity is, as I anticipated, creating virtual environments to access somehow cultural heritage, we need to set up a workflow to digitize somehow these cultural heritage objects into virtual environments. So we need to define a set of guidelines in order to support all the researchers that have to do this activity in the context of all the case studies that we have defined in the context of this project, to work at the same level, with the same process, to produce the same kind of data in order to control the process and to be sure that at the end we have objects that are fair compliant and open science compliant. And for doing that, in order to define these guidelines, because there were not a clear guidelines shared across the group of researchers there, we have started to run an exemplary research project within the context of this big project that allowed us to experiment on the field on this workflow of acquisition and creation of all these concepts that allow us to produce fair, compliant data describing a cultural heritage object here. And for doing so, we have decided to use the temporary exhibition that ended already at the end of May, dedicated to Ulisse Lorandi, that was the main exhibition in Palazzo Poggi in the past months, basically. Okay? So the goal was, basically speaking, to devise this set of guidelines to implement this digitization process, with the final goal of creating a digital twin of the temporary exhibition. The goal here is twofold. First one, since it is a temporary exhibition, the first question that we had is how we can preserve it. So how we can have it available as a thing, touchable thing, even from a digital point of view, after it finishes its, let's say, real life within the areas of Palazzo Poggi. And the second is another aspect. Once we have it, how can we use this new setting for the exhibition to go beyond to the narratives of the in-person exhibition, to add more things, something that cannot be done with physical let's say, implementation of the exhibition, but something that can be implemented in the digital ecosphere in order, for instance, creating new narratives between the various pieces in the exhibitions, but also pieces that are not described, they are described in other places, in other digital libraries, for instance, and these kind of things. So these are basically a bunch of questions that we have tried, and we are trying to answer because it's an ongoing work. As I anticipated, preserving, making accessible, what is the impact of the constraints you have when you are acquiring these things in digital ecosystem? The classic example of there are glass cases, and how can you acquire the object that you see beyond the glass in a way that is, let's say, very close to the real thing? There are a lot of, let's say, shortcomings, issues that we have to address during the acquiring phase in particular. How to handle peculiar material that the object have been made of. How to have a kind of process that allow all to interact with each other in order to provide first their own contribution and then to put all the material in a way that allow user to access knowledge. And also the last 2 points are entirely about the peculiar, the specific 3D models that we are creating must be handled in a specific way, or we should use the same approach we use for any digital image for publishing and providing them, or we need different policies or technologies for make them accessible in the fair, let's say, from a fair point of view, and also how we can apply the fair principles to these 3D models, because they are a peculiar kind of type of outputs. Let's say it is different from others. So probably we need to adapt sometimes fair principles for apply them in this specific context, and also what are the issues that may arise. So these are open questions. Some of those have already kind of answers, some are part answers, some other are still under investigation right now. So very briefly, how we did. Okay, so let me talk very briefly about how we decided to approach this problem in order to have at the end of the story objects, 3D models that are fair, compliant. First of all, in order to create the digital twin, we have organized the entire process of digitization in 7 different steps. We have involved a lot of researchers with very different backgrounds. One thing that I just learned by doing this process is that you need very different expertise for doing the job in the right way. So we have involved different departments, even different institutions. CNR was also involved. It's one of the partners of the project. We started with the acquisition phase, so the object there in different situations, but let's say available in front of the researcher, and we acquire the project, the object, then we need to process the data to model what we have processed, because sometimes the process is not perfect, so you have to remodel with the shapes there in order to make it compliant with the real object, then optimize let's say the object, the digital object, because the final goal is to provide this object accessible to all users. So the goal that we have in mind is that if we want to make them accessible, the user must be used their own device for accessing the cultural heritage objects, smartphones, tablets, their own computer by using browsers. So we have to optimize the models in a way that it makes the interaction with the object feasible in an environment that is under the control of the user, not us. So typically within the browser. We have to export then the final object and to create the metadata. Once we have the final object, we can create all the metadata related to the object. We will see that the metadata we have in mind are a lot of data. The bibliographic information about the object itself, so the original one here, but also a lot of other information that are necessary to be kept in order to, let's say, tell the story of the digital object we have created. In our mind, the digital object we have created is a new thing per se, even if we started from an existing one. The work to do that new digital object is an authorial work. It's something very big to do. I mean, it's not just a copy. Okay, there is crafting there. And then after the metadata creation, to upload the object on the web in order to allow user. I used to say this term usually when I discuss with other colleagues, miming, to look at that digital twin from her house. That is the point. And for doing that, we have used, well, the funny thing is that a lot of different expertise, some very expert in the acquisition, some very expert in the processing and modeling, some very expert in the optimization and in the uploading on the web, some very expert in the metadata. A lot of people with different expertise there, but all of them have to provide kind of a source raw information for keeping track of this process. And the easiest way to go for this, it happened also in other projects that I've done in the past with other kind of objects, honestly, not cultural heritage objects, well, intangible cultural heritage objects, I will have to say, but the way to go are tables. Tables works. Tables have a very low cognitive level for understanding what is there. Each row represents an object where it has been placed in a room, in a specific case. The title of the object, what is the status, if it has been acquired, processed, and so on. And in the following part of the table, there are a lot of information about every single step. So we kept track of when we started the acquisition, when we finished, when we started the processing, and when we finished for each single object. Because one of the also goal here is to understand how many time you need for processing or modeling an object, depending on the type of object and its own characteristics. So that is a way to collecting a huge, let's say, catalog of work done for a specific project, also for creating some sort of general categories that allow us also in principle, once we have it, to understand how much time we need for doing a similar experiment in another temporary collection. So it's also a way in order to define kind of guidelines and also time frames needed for doing this kind of job that is not yet finished, as I anticipated. The acquisition process that we have used two different techniques for acquiring the objects. For some objects, we have used structured light projection scanners. The different groups had available at the University of Bologna had available two different kinds of scanner of the same brand. It is Artec. We had the Space Spider and the Artec Eva. That are Spider for small objects, Eva for bigger objects, medium size object, honestly. And we have used also photogrammetric techniques by using different cameras there for catching for acquiring some of the object. And we did it at the museum. So we were here in Palazzo Poggi on Monday, that is closed. So we had the possibility to access the area. Thanks to the people working there that made available us some facilities like camping tables for creating spots for getting objects into the secret room, or we reuse the marble tables that were available in some of the rooms of the of Palazzo Poggi itself. For doing this acquiring process, that was the thing that we had to do there. There were time issues there because we started in March. The exhibition ended in May, at the end of May, and we had available only the Mondays for doing the job from 9 to 4 p.m. So it was kind of run, I would say, but that worked in the end. We also had the chance to access the museum. Some of the rooms were closed because they were, putting new things there after the temporary collection. So in these closed rooms, we had the possibility to access them also during the following 2 weeks, also in different days. But that was not easy, I would say. And then we have done, I don't want to provide a lot of details. Actually, I put references across all the slides, and also here in the very first one, maybe. Here, there is the reference to the preprinted, let's say, total describe the whole process that I'm just sketching here. So after that, there are basically other steps that we have done, we are doing right now. Processing, modeling, optimizing, and exporting. We have used different kind of software for doing all these kind of jobs. This software that has a start is actually an open source software. So there are proprietary software, but also open source software. We are experimenting also with open source software in order to understand if we can devise a workflow which can be implemented by using open source software, something that is not clear. I mean, there are some specific steps that are in the open source software is more suitable to be used, like reimagining, exporting, modeling. Blender is a kind of good software for that. It is open source. More difficult the processing part. We usually get proprietary software related to the scanner, for instance, works that well for me. But there is just things that we would mention. Here are two examples of two objects that have been done. That one is the narrow truth. That is actually also the origin of the one of the possible origins of the myth of the unicorns, because to remember kind of from the unicorn, and that is my favorite one, just because we started with it. It's the basilisk. It is one of the monsters of Aldobrandis, and the basilisk was beautiful from any means, from all the perspectives, because it was the very first one that had to return to the original museum. So we had available basically one shot for acquiring it, and we decided to go through a photogrammetric techniques here for doing that. Was also in the previous slide. The guy there is still the basilisk, and in order to be extra sure that we had enough material for doing the acquisition, the person who dedicated the entire day just to take every possible picture of that guy to be sure that we have enough material to reconstruct it correctly in one shot. That worked. It was a risk, but when you have to deal with temporary exhibition, that is a common risk. And in addition to that, by using the maps of the exhibition that we had available, we started to rebuild the rooms of Palazzo Poggi in Blender in 3D in order to create the environment where to put the object where they were originally in the exhibition. So, as I anticipated, there are a lot of people involved in that. Some is dedicated. There are also people with all the frescoes and the roofs of the rooms that were kind of complex to have, I would say, in the digital, but that is basically the approach we are following. And that is basically all for what concerns the technical work on the objects. In addition to that, there is one of my last slides, metadata. So, as I anticipated before, FAIR principles say explicitly that metadata are a crucial part that should be considered to make an object like a 3D model like that one, or even the digital twin, is complex infrastructure in the end, run by the software, to render these kind of things fair. But metadata are not just descriptive things about the object itself. In this context, we need to keep track of a huge amount of metadata from very different perspectives. So we have decided to keep track of 4 different levels of metadata here. First of all, bibliographic metadata. That are metadata about the nature of the original real object we are acquiring. So, what is the title, who was the author, if it is known, the provenance, so which is the museum that is preserving it. Maybe we have it just for the exhibition and then we have to return it, or maybe something that we have within the system of museums at the university. So all the information, the subject classification of the object, which kind of object we are dealing with, is a book, is a statue, is, I don't know. So a lot of information about the object itself. Here the curators, of course, help us a lot because they have kind of clear knowledge of what are the descriptive information of the object they are curating and preserving. Then we have to keep track of all the details of the digitization process. These are metadata. They are important because, as I anticipated before, the digital object that we are creating is a new thing, is made by not the same author that have created the original physical object. It has been created by us researchers. So we need to keep track of all the people that have participated in this creation, who have participated in which step, and all these kind of things. And that is a lot of additional information. Actually, we need more information, more data for describing the digitization process than the bibliographic metadata of the object itself from which we started. Then, all these data, describing all these metadata themselves may have provenance. We are collecting them, as I showed you before, all this information, since there are a lot of people involved, we are collecting them in tables, okay? But that table is not the final format. The table is not enough for guaranteeing huge interoperability of the metadata. We need to use more appropriate format, semantic formats in particular, to make the data easy to be processed and interpreted also by machines. And for doing that, we decided to use linked open data formats. So semantic web formats for publishing this kind of metadata information. The point is that in time, and that happens every single time, metadata information may vary because I can decide to extend it with additional information. Maybe I found a mistake and I want to correct it. All these kind of possible variations, possible modification of the descriptive metadata at any level that we have may vary. We can define a new digital object starting from the processing that we have because we are trying to apply different techniques for the model. Everything may happen. And we need to keep track of these descriptive changes in the metadata. And in order to keep track of all these descriptive changes, so in order to reconstruct also the whole history of all the information associated to the entity that we are carrying of, we need to provide possible approaches for doing this keeping track, and also to rebuild the history of the metadata. So the first snapshot of an entity, the second one maybe has updates, what has been added compared to the previous one. So to have a backlog of what happened. So for doing these kind of things, all these kind of things are very important in order to be sure to, let's say, comply with FAIR principles, from all the FAIR principles, in particular also the reproducibility. And in particular, the last 2 points are crucial for convincing other people that the data that we provide, the 3D model that we provide, are reliable and trust. You can trust them. Okay. So they are there. All of these metadata are crucial from also an let's say a policy-oriented point of view. By being transparent about everything there, you just say, look, this is what I've done. Okay, trust me because I just told you everything. Okay, that is the idea. So they are important aspects to consider. And we have a range of course standards. We wanted to avoid to reinvent the wheel. Yeah. Okay, we want to use existing standards out there for describing this data with formats that are compliant with this semantic web environment to make this data and metadata easily interoperable. That's the idea. And so we have reused CIDOC, CDOC, I don't know how to pronounce it every time. People have different ways to pronounce it, but the CIDOC conceptual reference model, which is one of the main standards for describing cultural heritage objects in general, and events related to cultural heritage for describing the geographic data of the object itself. We are using an extension of CIDOC's CRM that is named CRM Digital that has been developed for digitization, for describing digitization processes. So for keeping track of all the detail about the digitization processes. We are using the provenance ontology for tracking the provenance about the metadata that we are creating. So here, what have done that, who have done that, who have done that, added that information, who have where the original table with all this information is stored, all these kind of things. And finally, the open citations data model, which is the data model for disclosure here, I have developed for a specific digital open science infrastructure that I'm directing, which we started to work on this idea of keeping track of changes of the data. And so we have just reused the part of the data model related to change tracking in order to implement it in this context. So these are all the different standards that guarantees us basically to be compliant somehow with the FAIR principles when we publish these 3D models that we put there. And finally, the publishing. So after we have done the entire process, we have the object done with the metadata. We have to publish it somewhere. So we decided to use these two different tools. One is a tool developed by the Institute of Scienze del Patrimonio Culturale that is different, let's say, units around Italy. Bruno Fanini is the main of the software. And it is wonderful tool because the entire web-based software developed in JavaScript, not JS in particular, that allows you to create your own digital library to start, but also to upload the room of the digital twin with all the objects there. So it's something that we will use to basically allow users to interact with the object. And these objects here are digitized from the Aldo Brande's exhibition. So that was a night. There is a glass with 3 lines there, and we could not take the glass out of it because it was an entire object. So it was a nightmare to just, have a digital version. So this is the idea. We have all the books, all the books for almost all the books that have been exposed there. We have the 3D version of the book with the page that was open there. But then we are, thanks to the data technology and all this metadata stuff, we are interlinking with the scanner, the scanned version of the entire book available in IMS Historical from the digital library of the university. So we are creating already additional connection with stuff that we have in another place. This is for user consumption, let's say. Then is the general purpose repository that have been made available by CERN, which can be used for uploading their data, any kind of data. And we have created a specific community related to the scope 4 of the project, where we upload everything there, deliverables, presentations, whatever, and where we will upload also the each single, say, object that we have created for a long-term preservation of the object itself. So that is, let's say, the process, the tools, the technologies, the formats, the methods that we are using. There are more details in the paper that I put in the bibliography in case you want to get more information there. And that was basically all I have to say. Also because, yeah, I am a bit late, but in a sense, the entire presentation that I wanted to show you today is entirely based on a running project. So it's something that we are doing right now. There are no, let's say, clear answers to all these questions. There are tentative answers. Maybe they won't be the only answers to this question. Maybe there are other means to answer these specific questions, but we are trying to push a bit more on that direction in order to see what we can reach by running this project that is entirely based on cultural heritage object, digitization of cultural heritage object, and how to put them on the web in a way that are easy to access and so easy to be reused and so fair compliant, basically, according to all the guidelines that you can find in all the documents that I introduced at the very beginning. And in case you need, there are a few websites linked at the end, and the icons that I've used in particular in the first part are from this flaticon.com website that allow me to reuse them, basically. And that's all. Thank you.